But let's get started. Okay, so the number one question I get when talking about this for the first time, when people are new to this, they're like, why should I care? Why should I learn this stuff? And I thought it would be useful for me to kind of tell my story and why this was useful to me, and hopefully we can kind of extrapolate from that. So we've already talked about this a little bit, but I started off as a project manager building websites for like a marketing company. So it wasn't like a tech company, but they had, you know, a digital department. And one day I went from project manager to product manager. I got lucky, I guess. They just said, you are now a product manager. We heard those are cool, and you know, those are what are a big part of other tech companies. You are now a product manager. And they also said, you are also going to do a different process for building things. You're going to use what's called Agile and SCRUM. And I didn't know what that was, and neither did anyone in my department, so they hired a consultant to come in and train us on this stuff. And it was a 2-day course, and before I went, my eyes had like glazed over. I thought this was going to be super boring, you know, process and all that stuff. But it turns out, while I was taking this course, by the end I was like all amped for Agile and SCRUM. Someone would have told me that before I joined that class. I would have thought they were crazy, but I actually really like this stuff. I think it's really interesting because it gets to the heart of like how teams work and things like that. So to answer the question of how this has been useful, as soon as I started learning about product management and Scrum and Agile, and I started looking, well, as soon as I changed my title to product manager on LinkedIn, you get like a lot of recruiters and stuff reaching out, and I looked at like all of these job requisitions, and every single one of them had Scrum or Agile or something like that. You need to know this stuff if you want to work at this place. So I thought, okay, I really need to learn this stuff, and I did. And this actually became one of the like differentiating things for me to get my foot in the door somewhere else, was to know this stuff and know it well. So that's how it's helped me. But in terms of like how this is useful for everyone else, and in general, this is the most popular process for building digital products in the tech industry. It's the standard out there, at least for now. Like I said, this is a good way to stand out. If you know this stuff, and you know it well, and you can demonstrate your knowledge to other people, this is immediately identified as something very, very useful to the success of the company, and you will easily be able to stand out amongst your peers. Lastly, and this is probably most important, it's a very great way to get things done. Okay, so with that, let's jump right into it. So what is Agile? So all it is a collection of principles that are like guiding principles for how to build software. And I like to categorize these principles into 5 categories. They're adaptable, rapid, collaborative, team-oriented, and quality-focused. So I figured we'd go through each one of these, and I'll go into detail for each principle that falls under these. Also, if you're curious, you can go to the agilemanifesto.org/principles. That's where these things live. I highly recommend looking at these, memorizing these principles, or at least making yourself familiar with them. But what I'm doing today is trying to just simplify these things. So let's start with the adapt category. So I actually have these written out. So our highest priority is to satisfy the end customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. That's pretty self-explanatory. It means that the customer's needs change, the market changes, and you have to be able to satisfy them. Next is to welcome changing requirements, even late in development. And agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. And I put an asterisk next to that one because that's the one that usually scares the hell out of development teams. Because most developers, they want a full plan written out. Every use case has been accounted for. There's no edge case that no stone is left unturned. They want to just know exactly what to do and go build it. Now, when I say welcome changes, it doesn't mean that this is just absolute chaos. It's kind of controlled chaos. So, and we'll talk about the way that we manage changes when we get into Scrum. And the last thing is, to always be optimizing your process. So at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, and then tunes and adjusts their behavior accordingly. This one's really important. I would say one of the most important ones, because if you're not improving, you're not doing Agile right. Okay, under the rapid category, so number one is to deliver working software frequently from a couple weeks to a couple of days even, with a preference on the shorter time scale. And we'll see how Scrum applies this principle when we talk about something called sprints, which you may have heard of. And then next, simplicity, or the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. So always keep it simple as possible. I've seen people try to implement this process and try to account for, well, what if it goes off into approval this way, or, the CEO tries to come down and change things, and they try to account for every possible situation. Don't do that. Start simple, start simple, start simple. All right, under collaboration, so business and dev collaboration, business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. The best way I've seen this done, and this may sound scary, is for business people to actually sit near the developers. There are rules against, protecting the developers from constant shoulder taps and things like that, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Scrum Master role. The symbol I like to use for a Scrum Master is a shield, because they protect the developers and things like that. But there is a lot of value in business and development working closely, right? You want to make sure that the business aligns with what we're actually building. And next, face-to-face conversation is the most efficient and effective method of communicating information. So this one's pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of different ways to communicate these days, right? And face-to-face conversation is still the best way to interact with your team. And if I had to, yes, question?
So what happens when you have, development teams scattered around the world?
Very, very common. And the next best solution is video chat. Yeah. So if I had to rank all the methods of communication from best at the top to worst at the bottom, number one is face-to-face conversation, if possible, which that's not always possible. We have an office in Mumbai, and we work remotely with them all the time. And so face-to-face is just not possible. But after face-to-face, it goes video chat, then a phone call, then text chat, and then email is down, really far down. Email's terrible. Okay. Next, under the team category, so build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. Pretty straightforward. This I translate to higher level people not coming in, kicking the door in and say change everything. Trust your people that they're smart and they know what they're doing, and that if anyone's going to do the best job of programming, it's probably your programmers. This one's hard for higher level people to get into their brain, but if you're going to be an evangelist for this kind of stuff, you gotta set those boundaries, right? Agile processes promote stable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. So I translate that as zero overload. Don't have your team stay late, or work overtime, or weekends, and things like that. It's important that they stay happy. Lastly, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. So this one sounds kind of weird, but all it's saying is that the best teams, or you're just going to do your best work when you're doing the job that you want to do. Now, if you're a developer and you get hired to develop, that makes sense, right? I think this one is a little more geared towards smaller companies and startups and things like that, where you kind of have to wear multiple hats and you can choose what you want to do. But another way to interpret this is that if you're a developer and you're interested in design, don't be afraid to to learn from the designer on your team. Or if you're interested in product management, don't be afraid to ask questions about product management. The more you know about what other people do on your team, the better it is for the team in general. Lastly, under the quality category, so work in software is the primary measure of progress, and this just means, a few bugs. And continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. So this just means plan for, upkeep and cleaning code and things like that. Don't let that go by the wayside, because that stuff will build up. You get tech debt, and that will bog down your product and your development cycles a lot if you don't pay attention. Okay, so to answer the question, what is Agile? It's all of these things. It's just a list of principles to keep in mind when you're building things. So that's all well and good, but it would be nice if there was some kind of process to apply all this, right? That's where Scrum comes in. So what is Scrum? Well, if Agile is a set of principles, Scrum is a framework or process for applying these principles. It just formalizes the whole thing, so it makes it a lot easier for teams to jump in and start applying these principles, right? Okay, and the word comes from rugby. I don't know if you've ever seen rugby on TV. It's not very common out here, but you see like this huge huddle of guys, and they're all moving in the same direction, even though they're on different teams. But that's kind of the concept, right? Is you have this tightly knit team that is all going in the same direction. Okay, and when we talk about Scrum, all it is two things. Scrum is made up of a Scrum team that participates in what are called Scrum ceremonies. That's just a fancy word for saying meetings. There's some weird nomenclature stuff here. Okay, so let's talk about the Scrum team first, and then we'll go into the ceremonies. All right, so what is a Scrum team? So first of all, a Scrum team is usually small. It's 7 plus or minus 2, so it could be as little as 5 people. Anything less than that, you probably won't have all the skills you need to build what you need to build. And it can go up to 9. These are guidelines, right? But anything past a team this size and collaboration starts to suffer. You start needing middlemen to coordinate between different people. This should sound familiar if you're using waterfall processes right now. But just for now, let's say the team is 7 people. So the number one characteristic is that these teams are small. Number 2, the team is cross-functional. So this just means that you should have all the expertise you need on this team to build at least 80% of the things that they're supposed to build. And lastly, it's self-organizing, so people should do the job that they want to do. Obviously, if you're applying for a product manager job, you probably want to be a product manager on the team. Okay, and these Scrum teams are made up of 3 roles. One is the, the product owner. Number 2 is the Scrum Master, and number 3 is what's called the team. It's weird that this part right here is called the team, but the whole thing together is called the Scrum team. So again, weird taxonomy there, whatever the word is. But just keep that in mind. When I say Scrum team, I mean everyone. When I say team, I mean just the people doing actual work. That's how I like to call it. Okay, so let's talk about the product owner first. What is a product owner? What do they do? So typically, product managers play this role. Makes sense. There's a lot of overlap. And the product owner has a few roles, a few responsibilities. Number 1 is to know the customer. Their job is to represent the customer, because the customer can't be in every one of your meetings and say, I want this, I want that. So it's the product owner's job to go out there and know what they want. There's a lot involved in that. And it's a big part of product management is looking at usage metrics of your product. What are they doing? Gathering qualitative feedback from surveys, or flying out to see customers. We had T-Mobile come in today. I was talking with them and getting chewed out about all the things they want from my product today. But that's their job, right? Is to understand the customer so well that they can represent the customer in all the ceremonies and meetings in this process. Next, they write what are called user stories. So I think this is a good time for us to talk about what the heck a user story is. So user stories, all a user story is a way of writing requirements from the point of view of the person that's actually going to use your product. And it's, there's like a framework for writing these things, and it looks like this. As a type of user, I want to, you put in some goal, like they want to do something, so that, and then put in why they want to do it. So the example I like to give is, as an orphan whose family was murdered by chickens, I want to order eggs with my breakfast so that I can avenge my parents. So this does a decent job of explaining who the person is. You get to know a little bit about them, what they want, and why they want it. Make sense? That's all the user story is. Alright, back to our scheduled program. Next, the product owner prioritizes what's called the product backlog. So what's a product backlog? All it is a list of stories, prioritized from most important at the top to least important at the bottom. How do you know which is more important than the other? You don't. It's like a mix of science and art, but the product owner is the one who is responsible for prioritizing these things because they're supposed to know the customer and what they want. So based on all the extensive research that they do, they will know how to prioritize. And that's a huge part of being a product manager. I get people asking me all the time, what's the priority, what's the priority? Okay. Lastly, they own the value of the product. The team can do really great, high-quality work in record time, but if no one's using it, that's the product owner's fault. Because if we're making a product that no one wants to use, what's the point of making the product? That's a big responsibility, and there's lots of responsibilities when it comes to making a product. But this is what the product owner is responsible for. They own the value of the product. Everyone clear on the product owner? Any questions? Okay. Next is the teams. Remember, different from the Scrum team, the team is that subset within the Scrum team. I put a hard hat because they do real work. And their job is to, number one, estimate work. And they do this with what are called story points, which we'll talk about when we get into a ceremony called Backlog grooming. So let's put a pin in that one, and we'll come back to it. They also estimate work in terms of hours, which is pretty straightforward. How long do you think this is going to take? And we'll get into that when we talk about the daily stand-up ceremony. Or, I'm sorry, the sprint planning ceremony. We'll get to it. Next, they build stories, so they do actual work, they build stuff. So these are people like designers, QA testers, developers, things like that. Their job is the easiest to understand in this. Also, they escalate blockers to the next role that we're going to talk about, called Scrum Master. What is a blocker? All it is something that doesn't allow me to do what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm trying to build this story, but I don't have an environment I don't have a QA environment to merge my code to, or I don't have the domain knowledge for this particular API. I need to call in someone from another team. And it's their job to raise their hand and say, I'm blocked, to the Scrum Master, and the Scrum Master, as we'll see, it's their job to clear the blockers. So, when it comes to the overall product, the team owns the quality of the product. That's their big responsibility. If we have a crummy product that has, it's just bogged down with all these bugs and everything and it's unusable, that's on the team. And the last one, I saved this for last because it's the weirdest. It's called the Scrum Master. It's a funny name, but it's very, very necessary. I put a shield there, and you'll see. So you'll see why in a second. But number one, the Scrum Master's job is to facilitate Scrum. So they make sure everyone knows what the Agile principles are, what Scrum is. They set up the ceremonies. They make sure everything is running smoothly. They also protect the team, hence the shield. So remember that business dev collaboration principle we talked about, where you want them to work closely together, but not too close. It's the Scrum Master that is supposed to step in and say, if you want to change things, there's a way to do that, but you can't be interrupting the work that the team is doing right Because to me, the most valuable resource within this entire process is your team's time. I don't know about you, but I'm always the dumbest person in the room. I work with people that are way, way smarter and way better at programming than I am, and I see their time as extremely valuable. And I turn to the Scrum Master to say, make sure that someone like me doesn't interrupt the team. Next, they clear those blockers, right? So it's their job to whack the moles and make sure that everything is running smoothly. And as you may have guessed, they own the efficiency of the team. So it's their job to make sure things are getting pushed through the pipeline as fast as possible. Any questions on the Scrum Master? Yeah.
So the product manager typically takes the product owner role.
Yep.
The Scrum Master, is that also typically the product manager? I mean, does the same guy don both roles, or are they different?
That's a great question, and no. So the Scrum Master is either a dedicated person, which is the best way to do it. You have someone where 100% of their job is being a Scrum Master and doing these things. That's the best way to do it. What happens more typically is that a developer or someone on the team will play the role, will dedicate half of their time to being a Scrum Master and half of their time to building these stories. But you can never, ever, ever have the Scrum Master and the product owner be in the same role. If I was a Scrum Master, what I want is a product that is incredible and really valuable to people out in the world as soon as possible. So if I was the one owning the efficiency, I wouldn't actually do this, but as a product manager, people would be staying late. I would be changing my mind all the time, do this, do that. It just gives too much power to one person. So it's kind of like, you ever see The Departed, where he's supposed to be finding the mole and he is the mole? It's kind of like that, where there's like the two conflicting things.
So who's typically the product owner then? Is that the more on the business side? Or?
Yep, product owner is typically a product manager, full-time job.
Sounds like you have two product managers then.
Here? How so?
You said the product owner and then the Scrum Master. Scrum Master is also a product manager, right?
No.
Oh, okay.
If the Scrum Master was also the product manager, that just gives one person too much power. But someone on the team can play the role of Scrum Master as well. So someone on the team can be both, but the product manager can never be the Scrum Master.
As a business starts to develop and get a little larger, is it unheard of for a single person to play Scrum Master for multiple teams? Or is it becoming
Yeah, that's pretty common. As long as it's their full-time job. We don't want someone who's developing and a Scrum Master for their team and a Scrum Master for another team. They will quit. Any other questions?
I have one more. If you go back to the two previous roles, how is owning quality different than owning value? So it's the team's responsibility to own quality, but it's the product owner's responsibility to own value. How do you distinguish between the two concepts, if that's the right question?
Yeah. So the way I like to think of it is if people are using the product, that's the product owner. You can have a really high quality product, you can make a Lamborghini, but if no one buys it, there's no value.
Okay.
Make sense?
Right.
Okay, Scrum Master. Alright, so that's the Scrum team. That's it. It's just 3 roles, it's a small team, it's cross-functional, and yeah. So let's talk about that next thing, which is the Scrum ceremonies, Scrum meetings. And I thought what we'd do first is look at a high level, and then we'll go into detail on each one. So easiest way to understand this is just to look at a timeline. Let's say this is a week or something. So the team kind of, they do this thing called backlog grooming, where they make sure everything's in priority order, and they add story points to the stories, which is the way that we estimate in Scrum. In backlog grooming, we'll go into detail on that. And then after that, they go into sprint planning, where they take those stories, they chop them up into tasks, and then add their hour estimates, how long is it going to take me, and then based on that, they look at like the total amount of time for the sprint and say, okay, we can do this many tasks. So the team has complete control over how much work they do in the sprint, and we'll go into detail on this. Next, you have your sprint, and let's say the sprint is 5 days. And during the sprint, you participate in what's called the daily stand-up every day until the sprint is over. And the daily stand-up is just for everyone to get on the same page. There's a lot of ways to do this, and we'll go into detail. At the end of the sprint, we do what's called the sprint review, where the team gets to present and show off their work for very good reasons. And after that is the sprint retrospective, where you look back at the sprint and you ask, what went right, what went wrong, how can we improve? Probably the most important thing in Agile. These two often get confused, sprint review and sprint retrospective, because they both start with R, at least for me. So, it's easy to confuse these things, so if you don't get it at first, it's fine. But it took me a while. Okay, and then before we go into detail on each one of these, you're going to see these little symbols at the top of the page, which stand for how often these ceremonies happen, how long they are, and who's participating. So let's start with backlog grooming. So this happens before each sprint. So if you have a 2-week sprint, make sure you have at least one backlog grooming before each one of these sprints. And we'll talk about what a sprint is and all that stuff in a second when we talk about sprint planning. And it lasts about an hour per week of sprint. So if you have a 2-week sprint, about 2 hours. There's a little tilde thing there. These are rough estimates. What I'm giving you guys is a guideline and a starting point, and you can iterate from there and find out what works and what doesn't. But start here, and then your teams can kind of iterate on what works for them. Like my team's gotten to the point where they can do backlog grooming in like half an hour and get through a few sprints worth, because they know each other so well and they know how to do each other's job pretty much, where they can just look at each other. It's like they're telekinetic or they're psychic or something. They can read each other's minds and they both agree this is how long it's going to take. And it's the entire Scrum team. So product owner, Scrum Master, and the team. And what's the goal here? So the goal of this ceremony is important. Number one is to walk away with a prioritized backlog, which is just, rank those stories, that list of stories from most important at the top to least important at the bottom, and that's on the product owner. And have estimated stories through story points. So let's talk about story points. So this is probably the most challenging concept to understand in Scrum, at least it was for me. But a story point is made up of, it has 3 characteristics. It's a little different than, like an hour estimate that just looks at time. A story point to me, not just to me, but to this process, is made up of 3 characteristics. 1, it's an estimate of how much effort is required. 2, how complex this thing is. And 3, how uncertain we are. So it's a point value that takes all of these things into account. Effort, complexity, uncertainty. So uncertainty is, all this means is, if you're not quite sure how to implement this story, let's say, you're working with an API you've never worked with before, or something like that, or I have a project right now, we're working with a third-party company and collaborating with them to add a feature. If you're more uncertain, it's something you haven't done very often, raise the point value. If it's something that this is routine, we do it all the time, it's not a big deal, the point value will probably be less. Now, a lot of people usually ask, well, what the heck's the difference between effort and complexity? Those seem a lot like the same thing. So the example I like to give is when I was growing up, I was the IT department at my house. I would set up the VCR, the DVD player and everything. Every time a new TV needed to be set up or something, no one even asked, I would just have to go do it. So let's say my task was to set up a TV. So the first time I did it, I'm hooking it up to like a DVD player and all that stuff, and I'm hooking up all the cords and everything. The first time I did it, it took me 10 minutes. So the effort is about 10 minutes, right? Second time I did it, it took me 5 minutes. Why do you think that's true? Yeah, because I learned from the first time. I got better at it. So the effort went down, but the complexity is still the same. I still had to do the same things. I had to put this thing here, put this thing there. The complexity is exactly the same, but the effort was different. Make sense? So that's the difference between those two. Okay, so with these points, the way it works is you select a story that is pretty routine. Try to find a story, something that the team does often and is pretty certain on how to do it, and something that's typically pretty small. And ask them to just put a story point estimate on it. This is totally arbitrary. Let's call it 3 points. It's doing this weekly maintenance thing. It's 3 points. Great. That we just pulled that out of our butt, but it means nothing right now. Where we start to understand these things is when we look at the next story. We look at the next story and then we ask ourselves, is it more or less effort? Is it more or less complex? Are we more or less certain about it? You take all those things into consideration, compare it to that first story. Let's say it's more effort, it's more complex, we're less certain. Let's bump the story points up. Let's call that 5 points. Then you look at the next story and you compare it to the first 2. And then you look at the next story and you compare it to the first 3. So over time, as you do this, the team builds an understanding of what a story point means. Does that make sense? It's all relative. Yeah?
As you're going through, do you retroactively change the points that you've done already?
Nope, never. We want, this is really sloppy at first, and we want to see that, and then over time it evens out. Never go back and change a story point estimate. Unless the team looks at it again in the next backlog grooming, and let's say they learned something from a previous sprint, like, oh, this is way less uncertain than we thought, we actually know how to do this. Then you can change it, but only change it in backlog grooming. Make sense?
Yep.
Never change it during a sprint, and we'll talk about what a sprint is. Another thing, yeah?
So when you say story point, there are 3 different components. So, I mean, how do you estimate, like, what points do you assign to effort, what points to complexity? When you say the story point is 5, then do you distinguish, like, the effort is 1 and the complexity is 2 and the remaining?
Nope. Let's say it was 1 point. That 1 point represents all of these things. And I know it sounds weird, but trust me, you do enough of these things and the team will start to understand what a story point means. At first, it means nothing. But it's supposed to represent these 3 things. So it's up to the team, because over time they'll build an understanding of what a story point means based on the estimates they've given on past stories. Does that make sense? It's a weird concept.
How to distinguish, because I have 2 different tasks and I assign 5 and 7 story points, then how do I compare the complexity? Maybe for those tasks the effort is same, but the complexity, I mean, it's very difficult to figure out all the 3 components when you have the cumulative number.
Yeah.
Like for 2 different things.
Yeah.
So how do you distinguish? That's one.
So we account for that in a couple ways. So one is that, so this is weird. Trying to represent 3 things with a single number, right?
Yeah.
So let's say the first story, the effort's low, the complexity's low, and the uncertainty is high. So it's a high amount of points. Let's say it's 5, because we are so uncertain about it. The next one, the effort's high, the complexity's high, but we know exactly what to do. We also say that's 5. In terms of story points, it means the same thing. I know it sounds weird, because it is, and this is probably the hardest thing for teams to grasp, but over time, the more they do it, the point is for the team to have a shared understanding of what it means, and they'll only do that by estimating these things together. And they'll only know that by shared experience of estimating these things in the past. So another way we kind of deal with that is these follow what's called the Fibonacci sequence. Is anyone familiar with Fibonacci?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's 1, 2, 3, 5, I don't know if you can read this, 8, 13, 21, so on. So all it is you take this number and this number to get that number. You take this number and this number to get that number. And if you notice, the space between these numbers gets greater the higher it goes, right? And there's a reason for that. The reason is that the more effort something is, the more complex it is, the more uncertainty there is, the less accurate we're going to be at estimating. That makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. If someone asks you how much effort is it going to take, or how many story points is it going to take to hammer a nail? 1, whatever. We have a good understanding of how to do that. But okay, how many story points is it going to take to build an entire house? I don't know. I'm probably going to be way off. My brother works in construction, and every single time they estimate how long it's going to take on a project that big, it always goes at least twice as long. And that's what that is trying to account for. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. But I guess your timeline is only 1 week, right? I mean, when you are doing this, your sprint, let's consider it's a week, so it's not, you're not looking way far ahead in future. So your scope is limited, so maybe teams have better visibility because the timeline is shorter than, when you talk about like building a house against like hammering the nails. So.
Yeah. I mean, when you think of the house as like the entire product, right? Mm-hmm. And a feature is like, I don't know, a light switch in a room. It would be nice for there to be light in this room, that's a feature. The idea is to take that entire project and chop it up into small pieces called stories. And we can talk about epics as well. And, a story needs to fit within the time frame of the sprint. So all a sprint is just a start and an end date. It's a window of time that is constant. 1 week, 1 week, 1 week. So if there's a single story that takes more than 1 week, that is no longer a story. It's called an epic. And an epic is just a collection of stories that fall under like a certain category. And there's flexibility on that, but if a story takes longer than 1 sprint, there's always a way to chop it up and make it smaller into smaller stories.
Is it usually the developers who develop the story points, or do the product owner or any other roles come in?
So as the product owner, I have no say in this.
Okay.
Because the people who are going to be best at estimating are the people actually doing the work. I don't program or not well. I'm a terrible designer, and I can't write automated tests to save my life. I would do a terrible job at this. But the team does this all day, every day. They're going to be best at it, so only they can.
Okay.
So Scrum Master doesn't, but if there's a Scrum Master who's also, yeah, then they can. Okay. And the way this works is we do something called Fist of 5. And the way it works is the Scrum Master, or sorry, the product owner talks about a story, says, as this kind of user, I want to do this so I can get this benefit, right? Hey guys, how many story points is this? And then the team talks about, okay, well, we're going to have to write automated tests for this. Okay, we're going to need to build a new data table and hook that up to the front end. And the front end guy is like, well, okay, then I need the service to be able to do that. And then the designer says, well, I could do that, but I think there's a better way of doing this story. And they have these conversations, and they talk about everything that would be required for the end user to get what they want out of this story. And you'll find that in backlog grooming, at least the first few times you do this, it is excruciating. It takes forever. Because for the first time you have these different parties who usually never talk to each other. Now they're talking to each other, and they're identifying all these ways in which they don't align. So when I first started rolling this out to my team at Cornerstone, our first backlog grooming was 2 hours. We got through 1 story. Now we can get through 20 stories in half an hour. And it's because over time, when the teams are having these conversations, they start to understand what's involved from each person on the team to accomplish this story. They start to understand what it's like to do someone else's job. So the way we do this is the product owner says, okay, here's the user story. Discuss amongst yourselves when you guys have a good idea of how many story points. We're going to do what's called Fist of 5. So on 3, we go 1, 2, 3. Let's say someone says, this is 3 points. And they all show at the same time. And the reason for this is so that someone doesn't influence someone else. Because if you went around the room and said, okay, how many points do you think? You say it's 1. And then you were thinking it's 2, but since he said 1, you'd probably say 1. It's just like a thing as people we do. I don't know, we're social, I guess. But we influence each other a lot. So when everyone does it at the same time, they're not being biased by someone else's estimate. Because if you said it was 1 and you're thinking it's 5, then you're starting to think like, oh man, he must be way better at this. I don't want him to think that I think this is crazy complex because maybe he thinks it isn't. I'm going to say 1, when that's not what you actually think. So everyone shows at the same time. They'd say 1, 2, 3, or 5, or they do like a 8 or whatever, or they start saying like it's a crazy amount. There's also apps for this where you can pick one of these numbers as a card, and everyone kind of holds it, and then at the same time they all show their number. And when you do this for the first time, you're going to see crazy variation. One person's going to say 1, the other person's going to say 13. And it's because to the developer this is super easy. All I'm doing is changing this one thing. But to a QA tester, yeah, well this affects like 90 pages in the system. This is going to take me forever. But the developer never knew that in the past, now he does. So what's going to happen is on 3, 1, 2, 3, everyone shows their number, and then the Scrum Master looks for the person with the lowest estimate and has them explain why they think it's that low. Then they look to the person with the highest estimate and ask them, why is it that high? And each, like the far ends, explain it to each other, like why they did their estimates. And then we do it again. For the same story, okay, let's try it one more time. And 99% of the time, the numbers are closer to each other. So they start to converge. Now, you don't have to be in agreement 100% of the time. We don't need everyone to say 3, right? Some people may say 2, some people may say 3, and they refuse to budge. That's okay. The way to settle that is we say on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you with this? 5 being like, this is great, I 100% agree with a story point value of 2 for this story. 4 is like, okay, that's fine, I'll take it. 3 is like, I don't know, maybe. 2 is, no, I don't think so, and 1 is absolutely not, we need to talk about this. If everyone shows a 3 or higher, move on. If people still don't agree, it's 2 or 3, it's 2 or 3, someone's like, absolutely not, it is a 3, and someone says, absolutely not, this is a 2, take the higher one. The reason for that is it's better to overestimate than underestimate. Because if you overestimate, and it turns out it was less, great, you just got more time to work on something else. But if you underestimate, and it turns out it's going to take longer, you just lost time. It's going to take you longer, right? So if the team can't agree, take the higher one. Make sense? Okay. So that's story points. I spent a lot of time on this because it's really, really important to this process. It just so happens to be one of the weirdest parts of the process. Okay. So that is backlog grooming. So next we're going to talk about sprint planning. So sprint planning happens before each sprint. Obviously you're planning a sprint. You do it before the sprint. It'll last for about half an hour per week of the sprint. If it's a 2-week sprint, it should be about an hour. Take as much time as you need though, especially in the beginning, things may take longer. And this involves everyone, product owners, Scrum Master, and the rest of the team. And the goal of this meeting is to create a sprint backlog, not to be confused with the backlog. So the backlog is a list of stories in priority order. The sprint backlog is a list of tasks in priority order. And we'll talk about that. So the way this works is you have your product backlog, right? Story 1, story 2, story 3, this is more important than that one, which is more important than that one. And for the sprint, you want to make a sprint backlog. So what you do is, starting from the top, grab that top story, drag it into the sprint, and chop it up into tasks. QA automation, writing database tables, design. And everyone who is responsible for that task, so it should be one task, one person, they put how long it's going to take in terms of hours. Just how many hours is this going to take? This one's 2 hours, this one's 1 hour, this one's 2 hours, the total is 5 hours for that story. Cool, we have, let's say, it's a very small sprint, and that's all we can handle. Great, this is now our sprint backlog. Make sense? And we'll talk about why we put the hour estimates when we go into the daily stand-up. The hour estimates are important. So what the team does is they do this for every story, making tasks, putting hours against the task. They don't assign them. Some people do. I really don't think you should. You just make a list of tasks for all the stories and put hour estimates on all of them until the team goes, all right, that's it. We have a week. These are all the tasks we can do in a week. So the team has complete control over how much work they're going to do in the sprint. So let's say it's a 40-hour work week. Some people do that. What we like to do is say that between meetings and lunch and just shoulder taps and just all this random stuff that happens throughout the day, people work 5.5 hours. So we say if it's a week-long sprint, 5 days in a week, we actually take a whole day out for all these ceremonies because you can see there's a lot of them. So we say, all right, it's a 4-day week, 5.5 hours for each day, math, and then that total is the total amount of hours for the sprint. You do that per person, you add up all these hours, and you'll see all these hour estimates add up, and once you hit your capacity, stop. You start doing more than that, people are going to be staying late, they're going to work overtime trying to finish this sprint, which we do not want to do. Remember, one of our principles is zero overload. We don't want people to be staying late. They need to work at a sustainable pace. So, the way we account for that is that the team is the one that decides how much work they're going to do. Makes sense, right? Also, one thing that I like to point out in this, whatever that total number of hours you come up with is, subtract 25% of it. And the reason for that is to plan for unplanned work. There is always, always, always something unexpected that's going to happen during a sprint. Let's say a critical bug comes in, or the CEO changes his mind about something, or I don't know. Something unexpected always happens. Account for that in your capacity by making your capacity a little bit smaller. Make sense? Okay. That's sprint planning. So let's talk about daily stand-up. So this happens every single day. So it's called a daily stand-up. It's called a stand-up because best practice is for everyone to stand during this meeting. The idea being that if everyone's standing, they want to get out of there as quick as possible because people don't understand. Yeah, it makes it so the meeting goes as quickly as possible and as efficient as possible. And if people start saying, just kick them or something. We have Nerf guns and we shoot each other. And it lasts for about 15 minutes. Anything more than that, you're doing it wrong. And it's the product owner, Scrum Master, and the team, so the entire Scrum team that participates in this. And what you do is you go around to each person, and each person answers 3 questions. What did I do yesterday? What do I plan to do today? And what's blocking me? And if there's anything blocking them, they bring it up with the Scrum Master after this meeting. We call them parking lots, but whatever. And the point of this is for the team to stay in sync, so that they all know what each other is up to, which is really useful when you're working on a team. But there's a formal way, or there's a way we can make sure we're in sync. And we use what's called a Kanban board. Who knows what that is? Kanban, it's, I don't know how to say it. People say it differently. Okay. So the team looks at this board. So what this board is this board full of tasks, right? The columns here are the statuses of the tasks. This is the simplest way to do it. This is how I recommend starting. A task goes through 3 phases. It's not being worked on, it's being worked on, it's done. Make sense? So what the team does throughout the sprint, as they're working, let's say this is a developer picks up this task, they say, okay, I can do this. All they do is put it in the in progress column, and now everyone can see that Jeff is working on this task. And during the daily stand-up, we all crowd around this board and we talk about what we did, and then everyone can look at it should match up. If it says this is what I did yesterday, this is what I'm going to do today, we should see that reflected in this board. So they do their work, right? And then they log their hours against this task. And then the next person grabs one, they log their hours against that task. So remember that task had an hour estimate on it, and then they're actually logging the actual amount of work that went on this. And then when they're done, they just drag it over to the done column. And then you grab the next one in that order. So remember those tasks that we made? Since we were grabbing from the top of the backlog, one at a time, to make those tasks, they're in priority order. So if you finish a task, you want to know what to work on next, grab the one from the top of the to-do column that you can do. Obviously, if you're a designer, don't grab a code one unless you're confident doing it. In which case, more power to you. But just grab from the top and move it through this Kanban board. So that's a Kanban board. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now what we do, we use a tool called Jira, and we actually have rows as well. And the rows are the stories. Make sense? So story 1 would be this row here, and under that story there's like 3 tasks. And then the next row, and then the next row, and the next row. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's a Kanban board. Very, very useful for the team to know what everyone's working on. And the goal, by the end of the sprint, is to get all these tasks over here. If you don't, it means you didn't achieve your goal. It happens. Okay, so that's the first goal of the daily stand-up, is for everyone to be in sync, and we do that with the Kanban board. And we answer those questions. What did I do yesterday? What do I plan to do today? And what's blocking me? And they also stay on track. The purpose of this is to stay on track. So how do we do that? We use what's called a burn down chart. So at the end of the stand-up, we all look at this. And you're probably wondering how we cram all this stuff into 15 minutes, but trust me, you get better at it. So anyone familiar with the burn down chart? What that is? Yeah? Okay. So this is where those hour estimates that we did in sprint planning come into play. And you know those hours logged that are happening? That also comes into play here. So if we look at this chart, on this axis is time. It represents the entirety of the sprint. So this is a 5-day sprint, 1 work week. So that's this axis. This axis is the total number of hours of all the tasks added up. So let's say for this sprint, the team planned, they estimated a total of 100 hours for that sprint. Make sense?
Yeah.
So what do you think the hours left should be on Friday, by the end of day Friday? 0, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we drew a line, this is the ideal burn down of work over time. The remaining work should follow this line. So If the team is logging work and the remaining work is going down, 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 and it's really close to this line, awesome. But that almost never happens. What more often happens is something like this. So this red line represents the actual burn down of remaining work in terms of hours. If this is happening, what do you think the team should do? This means they are going to finish all their work early.
They had too little planned for that sprint, they should pack in more.
Yeah.
Overestimating the amount of time it's going to take.
Exactly. They overestimated and they can pull in more work. If they decide to, they could just say, no, we're good. It doesn't happen, but in this process, the team has control over how much work they do, right? For the first time, they can actually control their schedule, which is important for keeping teams happy, right? So, I don't think I've ever seen this happen. What do you think happens more often?
The other side.
That, yeah, exactly. This happens all the time. This means the team underestimated how long it took. So let's say it's Thursday, we can see this huge gap here. We can tell we're not going to finish on time. What should we do?
Extend the sprint.
What's that?
Extend the sprint.
That's a great guess, though. What's that?
Rollover?
Make it a story. Yes, and there's always a new sprint. So what's going to happen is if we're not going to finish everything, we got to kick something out and it gets put into the next sprint. Doesn't have to. There's been a couple situations where it turns out we're not going to finish this thing, and then I decide, something happened in this week where the priorities changed. That's okay. We're not going to be able to do that. That's fine. I'm going to kick it out, put it back in the backlog, and we'll pick it up later. But it's not the highest priority anymore. Make sense? So this happens a lot. If this is happening consistently, it's because the team is doing a poor job of estimating. They're being too overconfident, which is very common. And the way to account for that is to put in more buffer in the amount of capacity. So say that instead of 100 hours, next time we'll say we have 90 hours to do everything. Then the likelihood of us finishing in time will be greater. Make sense? Okay. This is a real one. It's probably the best one we've ever done. So this is from one of my teams at Cornerstone. This red line, it's like a step ladder. It's not going to be a straight line, right? Because when you log an hour, it goes boom. You logged an hour, so it's like stairs. Sorry, a step ladder. And that's what the red line is. So gray line is the ideal burn down. The red line is what we actually did, so you can see we were pretty close to it. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Ah, crap. We didn't finish it. And this green line is the amount of work logged. So this one only goes up. So if we're doing this right, it should make a nice little X between that green line, the work logged versus the remaining work. Because as you log work, the remaining work goes down, right? Now you see right here where the remaining work jumped up. What do you think happened there?
Figuring out how they had overestimated the work.
Yeah. They were like, ah, crap. We didn't think of this one thing. We need to make a new task for that. So they added a new task. They put an hour estimate on it because every time you make a task, put an hour estimate on it. It jumped back up. But they figured out a way and they burned out. So does that make sense? Yeah?
Are new tasks added at the stand-up, or is it just added throughout the day?
Throughout the day. If it pops up, it pops up. We try to keep those to a minimum. So if we see a lot of this happening, it means we're doing a poor job of anticipating how much, or breaking down the stories into tasks. So this gets better with time as teams work together more closely over time and they work on these things. They should get better. Now, if this keeps happening, it's the Scrum Master's job to find out why, because they own the efficiency, right? They want things to go through the pipeline as quickly as possible, and you can't predict anything if the estimates are always way off. So it's the Scrum Master's job to find out what's going on and solve that problem. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. But being a Scrum Master can be hard sometimes. Okay. So that is the daily stand-up. The last thing is, in the stand-up that I mentioned, you say what's blocking me, and you take that to your Scrum Master. Because typically it's between you and the Scrum Master. You don't need to waste everyone else's time talking about your personal thing that's going on. And that's the daily stand-up. Okay, so next is the sprint review ceremony. This happens at the end of each sprint, ideally. This one's hard to get on the books. Most of the time, I mean, I've seen it. It doesn't happen every sprint, but you should try to do this at the end of every sprint. And we do a couple things here. First of all, I'll last about half an hour per week of the sprint. And you'll notice a new thing here called stakeholder. All a stakeholder is anyone who cares about what the team is building. It could be the CEO, it could be marketing, it could be sales, it could be an actual customer can be in on one of these things. And the goal of this is twofold. One is for the team to show off work. They actually get to show and take credit for the work they actually did. I don't know if you've ever been on, or if you've ever been in a process where, you know, people are building all this stuff and then whoever's in charge takes all the credit, goes like, yeah, that was me, you're welcome, you're welcome. This prevents that. It's the team themselves that are showing off their own work, so they get to take pride in their work, which I think is pretty cool. But more importantly, it's to get feedback. You have these stakeholders here to say, this isn't what I wanted. Or this isn't, I don't think this is the best way to achieve that user story. Remember, as this kind of person, I want to do this so that I get this benefit. Well, the way you did it, I don't agree with. I think you should maybe try this or try that. And it's up to the team to process that feedback and take it in. And if they want to make any changes, or not, they don't have to do anything if they don't want to. But the product owner will gather all this feedback and make a decision. Okay, should we make a change? If so, I'm going to write a new story for this. And then I'll prioritize it in that backlog again. It'll go through backlog grooming, we'll estimate it. It'll go through sprint planning, we'll dice it up into tasks, all that stuff. So it goes through the process again. So remember when I talked about changing requirements, that principle? That's where this comes into play. So yes, we welcome changing requirements, but only between sprints. Requirements should not change during the sprint. And the idea behind that is that you want your team focused and building something without plans changing from day to day, or minute to minute, or hour to hour, whatever. And the reason for that is this thing called context switching. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it's just the idea that people, when they're doing great work, they get in like the zone. It's also called like flow, where they start cranking out work and they're in the zone. And then if you tell them, actually, you know what, scrap that, we're not going to do that, do something else, and while they're in the middle of doing that, it takes them like half an hour to get back to that point, and it wastes a lot of time. So the Scrum Master is there to prevent, they got the shield preventing all that stuff from happening so that the team can achieve their sprint goal, which is to build all those tasks, right, to finish all those tasks. So things are welcome to change, but not during a sprint, only between sprints. Make sense? Okay. Last is the sprint retrospective. This has to happen after each sprint. It has to. It'll last for about half an hour per week of sprint time, and it's the whole team. And the goal of this is to increase what's called velocity. All velocity is, it's a fancy way of saying number of points completed per sprint. So you remember that example of me hooking up the DVD player? Let's say my sprint was 10 minutes. It's just, a sprint is just a window of time, right? My sprint was 10 minutes. Sprint 1, I did one of them. I hooked up one. It took me 10 minutes. Sprint 2, I hooked up 2 of them. The story points should be the same, or close to each other, right? So from one sprint to the next, the story points were different. So what this does is reflect that the team is learning and growing as a team and learning from each other and becoming more efficient. So you remember who owns the efficiency of this process? The teams.
Scrum Master.
Right. That is their #1 goal, is to increase velocity. They want to make sure that the team, from sprint to sprint, is able to achieve more. They're getting blocked less. They understand what each other is doing better. They are trying new things and getting new tools. And they do that. This is where those conversations happen. And the team answers 3 questions. What went right? What went wrong? And how can we improve? Now, last one is really, really important. What went right? That's just for everyone to pat each other on the back and feel good. I think it's important. What went wrong, I think, is really, really important. We talk about, like, oh, well, the product owner was in so many meetings we couldn't get them to approve these stories and sign off on them. So there was a lot of waiting around. So as the product owner, I would say, like, you know what, you're right. I'm going to start saying no to meetings. They're just going to have to deal with it. Things like that. So you just say, what went right, what went wrong, and the last one, how can we improve? And that's where the team really needs to think, okay, what can we do? Well, I heard of this tool that is great for automated testing. It can use this machine learning to write these things for us, and let's at least try it out. And let's say it works. Boom. We just cut down on QA time, and we can accomplish more in the sprint. Things like that. Very important. Okay, so I've been talking for a while, and we are done. So when we talk about Agile and Scrum, remember, Agile is just a set of principles. Scrum is a framework for applying those principles, and it's made up of a Scrum team that participates in Scrum ceremonies. And that's it. Any questions?
The website one more time that you have that on?
agilemanifesto.org. That's not my site. That just has these principles explained in more terms. They're a little bit more verbose. Also, one other thing, just a shameless plug for myself. That's me. I have a site called theprocessnerd.com where you can email me here if you have any questions about this stuff. So what I do on my site is, so since you know all this stuff, that's great, but how am I going to use this in real life? There's a tool called Jira. I have, like, all my clothes are Jira. It's like the industry standard project management tool that was built for Scrum and Agile. So it facilitates, it makes this whole process real. It is a little bit difficult to learn, so you can book time with me in the mornings, and I can show you how to use this stuff in real life. I can show you how to use this tool. And it's free. I think it's useful to just help people and just put in positive vibes. So with that, thank you.